I knew the right words. They formed in me the way breath forms before speech. Automatic, urgent, almost physical. I could feel them pressing against the back of my teeth, arranging themselves into something simple and necessary. Not a speech, not a challenge, just a sentence. A small interruption that might have changed the weight of the room, but I didn't let it happen. I sat with the words like a man holding a hot cup he pretended not to notice was burning him. I kept my face still. I kept my eyes where they were supposed to be. I listened the way I had been trained to listen. Not for truth, but for what was expected. There are moments when silence isn't empty. It's crowded, it has edges, it has rules. It tells you exactly what you are allowed to be. I didn't want to be noticed. I didn't want to be remembered. I wanted to pass through the day like a shadow that doesn't leave a mark on the wall. Because being remembered meant you had done something, good or bad, and I couldn't afford either. The words I wanted to say were not brave. They weren't noble. They weren't even dramatic. They were practical, almost boring. The kind of warning that sounds like irritation to the wrong ears. The kind that makes people turn and look at you as if you have brought mud into a clean room. And the room was always clean. Not because it truly was, but because we kept it that way. We polished the surfaces with routine. We scrubbed away doubt with repetition. We made a religion out of appearing certain. In that kind of place, uncertainty was a stain you never admitted to seeing. I could have spoken softly. I could have leaned forward just enough to be heard by the person nearest me. Not the whole room. I could have framed it as a question, the way cowards do when they want to be honest, but not responsible. Are we sure? A harmless question. A small pause. But even a pause can be an offense when everything is built on speed and obedience. I knew what happens to pauses. They are interpreted. They are measured. They are filed away in someone's mind like a note in the margin. Hesitation. And hesitation is a kind of disloyalty that never leaves you once it has been attached. So I rehearsed the warning without moving my mouth. I pictured the eyes that would flick toward me. The faint tightening at the corners of someone's face, annoyance disguised as discipline. I imagined the quiet afterward, the kind of quiet that isn't peace but pressure, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat because everyone else has stopped moving. I imagined myself explaining. Explaining is where you lose, because explanations admit you believed you had the right to interfere, and I did not have that right. Not formally, not in the way the world in that room understood rights. Rights belonged to those who could give orders and live above the consequences. The rest of us were meant to carry things, copy things, relay things, disappear. So I held the warning in my throat until it tasted like metal. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself they knew what they were doing. I told myself I didn't have all the information, even though I did, enough of it at least, to feel the shape of what was wrong. You don't need all the details to recognize the sound of something cracking under weight. The body understands danger before the mind is willing to name it. My hands were calm, but inside me something kept flinching, like an animal hearing footsteps. I watched my own silence form. It wasn't a single choice. It was a series of tiny decisions. To swallow, to breathe through the nose, to keep my lips together, to nod at the right moments. Silence is built the way walls are built, brick by brick, until you look up and realize you've trapped yourself inside something you helped create. And the worst part was how normal it felt, how easy it felt, how quickly I adjusted to the weight of the unsaid, like a man shifting a pack on his shoulders and deciding he can walk a little farther with it. I remember the exact second the word stopped being an option, not because anything dramatic happened, not because someone threatened me, but because the moment passed and the room kept moving without me. The conversation flowed over the place where my warning could have been, smooth and indifferent, as if it had never existed, and I let it. I let the sentence die quietly inside my mouth, and I stayed where I was, still attentive, compliant, already committed to the choice I hadn't spoken aloud. The first time I understood how a place could teach you silence, it wasn't through a threat, it was through comfort. Comfort has a way of making you obedient without raising its voice. It gives you rules that feel like safety. It offers you a chair, a cup, a schedule, a clear beginning, and a clear end. It tells you that if you do your part, small, precise, unquestioning, you will be left alone. And being left alone in wartime can feel like mercy. Our days had edges. They began before the light fully took hold and ended long after the last official words were spoken. There were forms to fill, messages to copy, numbers to confirm, names to spell correctly, dates to stamp. The machinery of war did not always sound like gunfire. Sometimes it sounded like paper sliding across a desk, the soft snap of a folder closing, the measured rhythm of footsteps in a corridor that never quite warmed. In that kind of world, hierarchy wasn't something you debated. It was something you breathed. You learned quickly that certain voices belonged to the room and others did not. Some people spoke and the air adjusted around them, as if the building itself had been designed to carry their words. Others spoke only when asked, and even then they kept their sentences short, offering them like tools rather than opinions. I was one of those. Not because I lacked thoughts, not because I didn't see what was happening, but because my role was to be close enough to hear, close enough to understand, and far enough away to be disposable. I was the kind of person who could be replaced in an afternoon without anyone needing to rewrite the plan. That knowledge sits in you differently than fear. Fear makes you shaky. This made me careful. The rooms where decisions were shaped were not theatrical. They weren't the dramatic chambers people imagine when they picture war. No endless shouting, no cinematic speeches. They were controlled, efficient. The same tables, the same lamps, the same walls that held maps and schedules like sacred texts. The atmosphere was less like a battlefield and more like a factory that happened to manufacture consequences. The people at the center of it had routines that never broke. They drank at the same times. They walked at the same pace. They asked the same questions in the same order. The predictability had an almost religious quality to it, as if consistency could ward off disaster simply by being consistent. And beneath that order, there was a specific kind of fear. Not the fear of death, not the fear of bombs. Those were everywhere, blunt and honest. This was the fear of being seen wrong, the fear of being the person who introduced friction into a process that demanded smoothness, the fear of being singled out not by a shout, but by a pause. A pause was more dangerous than anger. Anger passed. A pause stayed. When someone higher up paused after you spoke, you would feel your stomach drop as if the floor had tilted. The pause was a calculation. It wasn't about your words. It was about what your words implied, that you believed your perception deserved space in the same air as theirs. That was the true boundary, not what you said, but what you presumed. I watched men with strong hands and steady eyes learn to talk differently in those rooms. They learned to soften their sentences until they were barely sentences at all. They learned to dress uncertainty in deference. They learned to present concerns as logistics. Never conscience, never doubt. You never said, "This feels wrong." You said, "There may be a complication." You never said, "People will suffer." You said, "There may be delays." Even the language was trained to avoid responsibility. Words were made to slide past guilt without touching it, and I learned to do it too. At first, I thought I was simply being professional. That was the word we used. Professional. It made the silence sound honorable. It made obedience sound mature. It turned fear into discipline and cowardice into procedure. I became good at being invisible in plain sight. I could enter a room and be forgotten seconds later. I could hold a folder at the exact angle that suggested usefulness without presence. I could stand close enough to catch every detail but far enough away that no one looked at me when the air tightened. There is a strange intimacy in that distance. You see the small things, the private gestures people don't know they make. A thumb rubbing the edge of a pencil until the wood shines. A jaw tightening when a certain name is mentioned. A glance exchanged between two men who don't trust each other but need the same outcome. You begin to recognize patterns that don't appear on maps. You recognize who is allowed to hesitate and who isn't. Who can ask for clarification and who gets punished for it. Who can admit uncertainty and still be treated as intelligent, and who becomes a problem the moment they appear too thoughtful. I learned who never raised their voice because they didn't need to. Their authority wasn't in volume. It was in the way the room organized itself around them. When they arrived, chairs shifted, papers moved. Conversations corrected their tone automatically, as if the air had become thinner, and everyone needed to conserve breath. Orders didn't begin with shouting. They began with assumptions. Assumptions about what was possible. Assumptions about what people would endure. Assumptions about what could be sacrificed without anyone needing to name the sacrifice. I sat close enough to hear those assumptions become real. I heard plans described with clean words that made them sound inevitable. I heard the future spoken about as if it were already a document with signatures at the bottom. I watched questions get answered before they were asked, not because the answers were strong, but because the hierarchy didn't permit the questions to exist. And outside those rooms, there were other routines. Routine is insulation. Men ate and joked in brief flashes like matches struck in wind. Someone always found a way to talk about weather, as if weather were still a normal concern. Someone always had a story from home that made people smile for exactly as long as it took to swallow. People clung to these small things because they provided proof that we were still human. But even that humanity had rules. You could be human in the correct places, at the correct times, and only in the correct way. The fear wasn't just personal, it was structural. Speaking up didn't simply risk punishment, it risked identity, it risked belonging. Because the system was built to reward those who fit into it without protest, it had 1,000 ways to make you feel grateful for your place, even if your place was small. A nod from someone important, a quiet compliment about your efficiency, the simple fact of being near the machinery of decisions. Proximity can feel like power, even when you have none, and the closer you are, the more careful you become about staying close. I was not the kind of person who could storm out. I was not the kind of person whose absence would be noticed as protest. If I disappeared, it would not be a statement. It would be an erasure. So I stayed. I listened. I learned the boundaries without anyone ever needing to explain them. There were moments, even early on, when someone lower down attempted to interrupt the flow. Just a small correction, just a soft reminder, just a hesitant caution. And the room would respond in the same way every time, not with shouting, but with a subtle tightening, a freezing of movement, a faint change in temperature. The person would finish speaking and instantly understand they had stepped somewhere they weren't allowed to stand. Sometimes they were dismissed with a brief phrase that sounded reasonable and final. Sometimes they were ignored, which was worse. And afterward, in corridors, there would be no sympathy, no whispered admiration, only a quiet distancing, as if the person had become contagious. Because if you were associated with someone who questioned, you might be seen as someone who could question too. It was a perfect system, not perfect in morality, perfect in function. It didn't need to threaten you. It only needed to show you once or twice what happens to those who forget their place. After that, your own imagination did the rest. You would do the punishing yourself. You would censor yourself before anyone else had to. By the time the moment arrived, the moment my words first gathered with that sharp clarity, I already knew the cost of letting them out. Not because someone had said it to me, because the entire world around me had been designed to make sure I didn't need to be told. There is a particular kind of argument that never leaves the inside of your head. It doesn't resolve. It doesn't reach a conclusion. It simply circles, wearing down the same thoughts again and again until they lose their edges. That was how it began for me, not as panic, not as urgency, but as a quiet repetition. I would notice something small, almost trivial, a detail that didn't align with the others, a phrase used too confidently, a number that seemed stable only because no one had pressed on it yet. These weren't revelations, they were irritations. The kind of things you tell yourself not to fixate on, because fixating feels like arrogance. I told myself I was imagining patterns where none existed. That was the easiest explanation. It required nothing from me, and yet the thought returned, always the same shape, always at the same moments. It appeared when conversations moved too quickly, when certainty arrived too early, when decisions hardened before they had been tested by doubt. I began to rehearse conversations that never happened. In my head, I spoke calmly. I chose my words carefully. I avoided accusation. I avoided emotion. I imagined myself presenting the concern as an observation, not a challenge. Something neutral, something technical, something that could be dismissed without embarrassment. In these rehearsals, no one was angry. No one raised their voice. Someone nodded. Someone said they would look into it. The world continued. That fantasy was comforting. But then another version followed it, the one I didn't like to stay with for long. In that version, the room shifted as soon as I spoke. Not violently, not obviously, just enough. A pause, a look, a subtle recalibration. My words landed, but not the way I intended. They landed as friction. In that version, someone asked me a question I hadn't prepared for. Not about the issue itself, but about my role, my authority, my basis for concern. And suddenly the conversation was no longer about the flaw I had seen. It was about me, why I thought it mattered, why I thought it was my place, why I thought my perspective carried weight. I imagined myself answering, and in answering, revealing how little protection I had, how easily my caution could be reframed as hesitation, how quickly hesitation could be interpreted as weakness. I told myself that I was not afraid of being wrong. That wasn't true. I was afraid of being wrong publicly, in a way that made me visible. Wrongness was not evenly distributed. Some people could recover from it, others could not. I belonged to the second group. Every time I came close to speaking, another voice intervened. Not loud, not cruel, just practical. It reminded me of everything I did not know, everything I had not seen, all the information that might exist somewhere beyond my reach, neatly explaining away the concern that felt so heavy in my chest. It reminded me that people above me had survived other situations, made other decisions, carried other burdens. Who was I to assume this one was different? The voice sounded reasonable. It sounded mature. It sounded like self-control. I watched others around me choose their moments carefully. I noticed how rarely anyone spoke without invitation, how often people waited for a cue, a glance, a name spoken aloud before allowing themselves to exist in the conversation. The discipline was invisible but total, and I absorbed it. I began to measure my thoughts before I allowed myself to believe them. I downgraded certainty into possibility, possibility into doubt, doubt into something I told myself was not worth interrupting anyone over. There were nights when the argument returned with more force, when silence made the thoughts louder instead of quieter. When I lay awake replaying the same moments, adjusting the timing, the phrasing, the posture, trying to find a version of the warning that would not cost me anything. There wasn't one. Every version required me to accept risk, and risk in that environment was not shared. It traveled downward. It settled on the person least able to deflect it. I told myself that someone else would notice, someone more senior, someone with permission. I told myself that my silence was temporary, that I was waiting for a better moment, a clearer opening, a sign that the room was ready to hear something uncomfortable. But readiness was a myth. The room was never ready. It was designed to function without interruption. The fear changed shape over time. At first it was sharp, an immediate awareness of what might happen if I spoke. Later it became dull, almost procedural. I began to treat my own hesitation as evidence of wisdom. If I were truly certain, I reasoned, the words would force themselves out. The fact that they didn't must mean something. That was the most dangerous thought of all, because it allowed me to confuse caution with insight, restraint with responsibility. It let me believe that silence was not a choice, but a consequence of maturity. There were moments when the warning surged anyway, when the conversation turned just enough in the wrong direction that my body reacted before my mind could intervene. A tightening in my chest, a subtle forward lean, the beginning of breath. And every time I stopped myself, I reminded myself of the balance I had managed to maintain, of how easily it could be disturbed. I reminded myself that once words leave you, they do not belong to you anymore. They become objects others can use, reshape, or discard. I told myself that holding them back was safer. What I didn't allow myself to consider was that safety, too, had a cost. The moment did not arrive with ceremony. There was no silence beforehand that announced it, no sudden stillness, no dramatic shift in the air. It arrived the way most irreversible things do, embedded inside routine, wrapped in familiarity, disguised as just another step forward. I remember the posture of the bodies in the room more than the words themselves, the slight lean of attention toward the center, the way papers were already aligned, as if the decision had been waiting for confirmation rather than consideration. The way no one looked uncertain, even though uncertainty was everywhere, moving beneath the surface like a current no one wanted to name. The flawed decision did not sound flawed when it was spoken. It sounded complete. It sounded efficient. It sounded like something that had already happened. The words moved from one mouth to the room and settled there without resistance. No one interrupted. No one asked for clarification, not because the meaning was perfectly clear, but because clarity was assumed, and assumptions were safer than questions. I felt the warning rise again, faster this time, sharper, not as a thought, but as a physical impulse. My throat tightened, my jaw shifted, my fingers pressed lightly into the surface in front of me as if grounding myself might slow what was happening. This was it, not the last chance in some grand sense, not the final opportunity to save anything abstract or symbolic, but the last moment when my words could still exist before the decision, rather than after it, the last moment when they might still be interpreted as part of the process, instead of a reaction to it. I knew that distinction mattered. I could feel my breath preparing itself, like a body stepping forward before the mind has agreed to move. There was a precise instant, so brief it could not be measured, when speaking was still possible without consequence being immediate, when interruption could still be framed as clarification, when hesitation could still be mistaken for diligence. And I did nothing. The decision continued unfolding, sentence by sentence, each one sealing the previous one into place. It was not shouted. It was not celebrated. It was simply confirmed, like a door being closed carefully so it wouldn't make noise. As it became clear that no one else would speak, something in me shifted, not dramatically, quietly, the way muscles adjust when you realize you are not going to move after all. The warning began to change shape. It was no longer something urgent that needed release. It became something dangerous that needed containment. I felt it press inward instead of outward, settling deeper in my chest, heavier now because it was being actively held back. I told myself there was no point anymore. The logic arrived quickly, efficiently, as if it had been waiting. The moment had passed. To speak now would not alter the decision. It would only attach my name to dissent. It would mark me as a complication, not a contributor. It would not save anyone. It would only expose me. That reasoning felt solid, responsible even. I kept my eyes where they were supposed to be. I controlled my expression. I made sure my body did not betray what my mouth refused to say. I became very aware of how still I was, how carefully neutral. The effort required was surprising. Silence, I learned in that instant, is not passive. It demands precision. The decision was repeated once more, summarized, stripped of nuance, reduced to its cleanest form. This was the version that would travel outward. This was the version that would be remembered. This was the version that would not include any trace of doubt. I watched it leave the room, and with it went the last version of the warning that could have mattered. What stayed behind was not relief. It was not even fear. It was a strange, hollow steadiness, a sensation like standing very still after missing a step on a staircase, your body frozen, waiting for pain that doesn't arrive immediately. I became aware of small details with uncomfortable clarity, the sound of someone adjusting their chair, the faint scrape of paper, the way light fell across the surface of the table, unchanged by what had just been set in motion. Everything looked the same. That was the most unsettling part. The world did not react to my silence. The room did not collapse. No one turned to look at me with accusation or gratitude. Nothing signaled that a line had just been crossed. The machinery continued operating smoothly, indifferent to the absence of one voice that had never officially existed. I understood then why silence is so easy to live with at first. It does not announce itself as a choice. It disguises itself as continuity. It lets you believe that nothing has changed, even as something fundamental slips past the point of return. When the meeting ended, people stood with the same practiced movements they always used. There were nods, brief exchanges, a few quiet remarks about timing and coordination. No one lingered. No one looked shaken. The decision had already begun to feel old, settled, part of the background. I stood when it was appropriate to stand. I gathered what I was meant to gather. I followed the flow out of the room without resistance. My body knew how to do this. It had been trained. As I walked, the warning did not disappear. It remained intact, preserved, untouched by language, but it no longer felt like something I could use. It felt like something I would carry. That was the moment silence won. Not with force, not with threat, but with inevitability. And I did not fight it. The first sign that my silence had been costly did not arrive as catastrophe. It arrived as confirmation. Small at first, subtle enough that it could have been dismissed if I had wanted to dismiss it. A delay that lasted longer than expected. A report that came back thinner than it should have been. A phrase repeated too often in briefings, as if repetition might strengthen it. I recognized the pattern immediately, not because I was brilliant, not because I had special insight, but because it was the same shape as the thought I had buried. Seeing it unfold felt like watching a shadow detach itself from my body and begin moving on its own. No one spoke about it openly. Instead, language adjusted, words softened, explanations expanded. The problem was not denied, it was diluted, spread thin across logistics, weather, timing, human error. Each layer added just enough complexity to keep anyone from isolating the core of it. I listened, always listening. I heard people reassure one another with confidence that felt practiced rather than earned. I heard phrases designed to stabilize morale, not truth. I heard the subtle shift from expectation to hope, a transition that always signals something has already gone wrong. And still, nothing dramatic happened. That was the cruelty of it. The consequences did not announce themselves with spectacle. They arrived gradually, patiently, as if they were respecting the structure that had created them. Each step followed logically from the last. Each outcome could be explained without ever touching the original flaw. I began to recognize moments where my warning would have fit perfectly into the conversation, if it had been spoken earlier. Moments where someone circled close to the truth and then veered away, choosing a safer interpretation. Moments where a single sentence, placed correctly, might have redirected the entire understanding of what was happening. Those moments passed, one by one, and with each one the cost of speaking grew higher. What unsettled me most was how often I was asked to confirm things I no longer believed in, not directly, never directly, but through routine acknowledgments, through nods, through my continued presence. My silence was not neutral, it was being used. Every time I said nothing, it sounded like agreement. I watched the situation evolve into something harder to control. Adjustments were made, not to correct the underlying issue, but to manage its symptoms. Resources were shifted, expectations recalibrated. The machinery adapted, as it always does, to avoid admitting a structural failure, and people suffered quietly inside those adjustments. Not in ways that made good stories, not in ways that inspired speeches or recognition. They suffered in the way systems always ask people to suffer, incrementally, invisibly, without language. I became aware of the consequences before most others did, and that awareness isolated me further. I could not share it. I could not explain why each new development felt inevitable to me. I could only watch as the logic I had tried to suppress unfolded with a patience that felt almost deliberate. There were moments when others expressed confusion, when they admitted briefly that something didn't sit right. I felt a surge of something then, hope, perhaps, or the instinct to finally align my voice with theirs. But the moment never lasted. Confusion was always resolved quickly, smoothed over by someone higher up who needed stability more than accuracy. The structure closed ranks. Questions were answered with authority rather than evidence. The tone shifted back to confidence, and everyone followed it gratefully, including me. That was the part that sickened me most. Not that I remained silent, but that I adapted so well to the consequences of that silence. I learned how to move within the damaged structure, without drawing attention to the damage. I learned how to anticipate the next adjustment before it was announced, because I understood the flaw that made the adjustment necessary. My knowledge made me useful, and usefulness became another excuse to stay quiet. As time passed, the outcomes became harder to ignore. What had once been theoretical solidified into fact. What had been framed as temporary became permanent. The cost, which had been abstract at first, began attaching itself to real names, real absences, real voids where something or someone had been expected to return. There were no public acknowledgments of error, only quiet shifts in tone, a careful avoidance of certain topics, a gradual rewriting of expectations so that what was lost appeared planned all along. I felt something settle inside me then, not shock, not grief, but recognition. This was the future I had seen, in outline, when the words first gathered in my throat. Not every detail, not every consequence, but enough of the shape to know that this was not chance, and I had let it happen. That realization did not come with drama. It did not knock the breath from my lungs. It arrived the way truth often does. Calm, unyielding, impossible to argue with. I carried on because carrying on was required. But from that point forward, every development felt like a repetition of the same moment. The moment I chose silence, echoing outward, growing heavier with each step. Impossible to interrupt now because it no longer belonged to a single decision. It belonged to everything that followed. Time did not soften the memory. It refined it. The longer I lived with it, the clearer it became. Not blurred by distance, not dulled by repetition. If anything, memory learned how to hurt more efficiently. It no longer needed images or specific moments. It only needed silence, and it would do the rest. Long after the structure that held us together had shifted, renamed itself, or collapsed into something unrecognizable, the moment remained intact. Not as a scene I could replay in detail, but as a sensation that returned without warning. A pressure behind the ribs, a familiar tightening in the throat. The instinct to speak followed immediately by the knowledge that there was nothing left to say. People assume guilt announces itself loudly, that it arrives as anguish or visible remorse. Mine didn't. Mine was quieter, it lived in habits. I learned to pause before answering questions that had nothing to do with the past. I learned to measure my words carefully, not because I was wiser, but because I no longer trusted the instinct that told me silence was harmless. Every withheld thought carried weight now. Every hesitation felt suspect. There were moments, ordinary, forgettable moments, when someone would ask my opinion about something trivial, and I would feel the old reflex rise, the urge to stay neutral, to avoid friction, to keep my place. And beneath that urge, something colder, the memory of how easily neutrality can become complicity. I never spoke about what happened, not because I was forbidden to, but because language failed me. There were no words that could describe a warning that was never given without turning it into a confession I could not finish. To speak would require me to claim responsibility I had already avoided once, and I understood finally that I was capable of avoiding it again. That knowledge frightened me more than the past ever had. Sometimes I imagined an alternate version of myself, one who spoke, not heroically, not loudly, just enough. I did not imagine praise or redemption, only the relief of having crossed a line I had been afraid to approach. That version of me felt unreal, like a story told about someone else. The real version was the one who lived with unanswered questions, not questions about what might have happened if I had spoken. Those were endless and useless. The question that remained was simpler and harder to endure. How many times had I mistaken silence for safety before, without noticing? And how many times would I do it again, if the conditions were right? I came to understand that silence leaves no evidence. That is its greatest strength and its deepest cruelty. There is nothing to point to, nothing to confess that can be verified. No record of the moment you chose yourself over consequence. Only a private knowledge that cannot be transferred or shared. The world moved on. It always does. Names faded, places changed. The events themselves became summaries, then footnotes, then omissions. I watched history simplify what had been complex, reduce what had been fragile into clean lines and confident conclusions. My silence fit perfectly into that process. It required no correction. What remained with me was not the image of failure, but the understanding of how easily it had been allowed to happen, how ordinary the moment was, how little resistance silence encountered when it arrived dressed as professionalism, caution, restraint. I do not tell this story to warn anyone. I am not offering lessons. I am not asking for judgment or forgiveness. I am only aware now that the most decisive act of my life was one no one saw, and that the words I never spoke did not disappear. They stayed with me, unchanged, unforgiving, proving day after day that knowing the right words is meaningless when you choose silence instead.